Okay, thank you, Val. In 1938, Edward Sapir wrote,
Oh yeah, it will.
"The very variation and uncertainties which the earlier anthropologists ignored seem to be the very aspects of behavior that future students of society will look to with special concern. For it is only through an analysis of variation that the reality and meaning of a norm can be established at all." Given that, I think it's very fitting that today we welcome as Sapir Professor John Baugh. John Baugh is Professor of Arts and Sciences at Washington University, where he also serves as Professor of Psychology, Anthropology, Education, English, and Linguistics, and was Director of African and African American Studies, and he is Professor Emeritus of Education and Linguistics at Stanford. We wanted this to be an interdisciplinary institute, and with Professor Baugh, even if we didn't have anything else, it would be. Now, John began his post-secondary studies as a student of accounting at Temple University. But while he was there, he discovered Bill Baugh's seminal article, The Logic of Non-Standard English, and our field is richer for that discovery. He completed his dissertation at Penn in 1979, the first African-American student to graduate in linguistics from the University of Pennsylvania, when wondering why it took so long. And his dissertation was a detailed study of African-American English, and that research formed the basis for his first book, Black Street Speech. I know some of my students have read good chunks of that, if not the whole thing. A volume that showed the systematicity of African-American English, and in particular illustrated the relationship between copula absence in African-American English and Caribbean Creole. Now, I first met John in 1989, although I had read Black Street Speech a good deal earlier when I was teaching at a predominantly African-American community college and trying to learn all I could about the language of my own students. When I met John, he was already a tenured professor at the University of Texas in Austin, and he was a visiting scholar at the Center for Advanced Study at Stanford. While I had returned to graduate school to study sociolinguistics and second language acquisition. The following year, John joined the faculty at Stanford. I was in the final stages of my dissertation and was not able to take a course from him, and I am remedying that gap in my education at this institute. However, John was open to talking with a somewhat older graduate student, and we became friends. And I've turned to John for advice and support throughout my career, as have many, many colleagues. And it was at Stanford that John began his well-known work, which we'll hear a little bit about today, on linguistic profiling, work that had a profound effect on alleviating housing discrimination, although sadly not eliminating. And he began to look at issues of educational malpractice and the miseducation of African-American children and youth. Throughout his career, Professor Baugh sought to use the results of the scientific study of language to advance social justice. But for no means, especially for African Americans, but by no means only for African Americans. And a lifetime of this book can be read, a lifetime of this work can be highlighted in his most recent book, and I think it's up there, Linguistics in Pursuit of Justice. Now, I come from a working class family in New Jersey, and my social consciousness was formed in the civil rights movements and the anti-war movements. Like many in sociolinguistics, I was drawn to the field by the combination of academic rigor and the ability to use hard-won knowledge to advance social justice. I know of no one who exemplifies this ideal better than John Baugh. and I am proud to call him a mentor, proud to call him a colleague, and even proud to call him a friend. Please welcome John Baugh.
I had a student that once told me, she said, "Your voice is wonderful, except it puts me to sleep." She said, "You sound like an FM DJ, except you talk about stuff that puts me to sleep." I'm going to try to avoid that tonight. I'm so pleased to be here with all of you and sharing. I'm a student again. I'm in classes with all you brilliant young people, smart enough to keep my mouth shut and just, learn what I can. So again, Bob, thank you for that generous introduction. I want to acknowledge my funders. The reason the Ford Foundation appears in bold print is they have funded me repeatedly, and they provided the initial funding that allowed me to go to graduate school when no one had ever heard of me, right? And I was insignificant. I had no idea what I was going to do, and just wanted to maybe see if I could get a master's degree in linguistics, or maybe play in a fusion band. I was a professional musician, and I was going back and forth. And my former colleague Condoleezza Rice was studying to be a concert pianist, and made the observation that it was much easier to be Secretary of State. I wasn't at that level at all, but I enjoyed my professional musicianship. But linguistic science has provided me with an uplifting career where the benefits of being able to help others has been just one of the most tremendous gifts in my life. The National Science Foundation and all of the other agencies you see have been generous at different points in my career. Again, the Ford Foundation funded the work on linguistic profiling, initially in the United States, and then in South Africa, Brazil, the Caribbean, the UK, France. Every place you want to go on vacation, they sent me to study linguistic discrimination. I was also lucky enough to finish up my most recent book at the Bellagio Center in Italy, supported by the Rockefeller Foundation, and they have been the most recent generous supporter of my work. But before I move on, you guys should know that I grew up here in California, and I want to give the initial shout out to our hosts, right? All of you young folks in the red shirts, I know you're doing all the real work, and I want to thank you, and you, and you, and the people that are out in the lobby, because I know how hard this is. I've only hosted 2 or 3 4-day conferences, and they aged me tremendously. All right? So the fact that you guys are doing this for a month, thanks to all. A round of applause, please, for you're only going to hear about the complaints after it's done, right? But you're doing a lot of things right, okay? Also, if you're lucky enough to be here after the 19th, I'm sure they're going to have a hell of a party once we leave town. Okay. On the bottom row are the old heads. They're the people that I've known the longest. Some of you who are here at UC Davis know Robert Blake. Robert Blake is a professor of Spanish here. His photo appears on the bottom left. He took my very first graduate course in sociolinguistics when I was an assistant professor at the University of Texas. Many of you know Jack Hawkins. Jack participated in a conference that I hosted in honor of Joe Greenberg, and you just saw the introduction from Bob Bailey. I met Bob when he was finishing up his dissertation at Stanford, and then he went on to great things at San Antonio, and I believe I wrote a letter of recommendation that that they read it before they hired me here. Raul, found out today that he is a fellow sailor. For those of you that spend time on the water, he and I have our captain's licenses, so you can sign up after the Institute and go with us throughout the British Virgin Islands on a catamaran, and that'll be special for everybody. Georgia, what can you say? She smiles throughout all of these things, right? Orabun crashes. She's like, hey, we're all right. We got a good Okay. Kristen here, all right? Kristen taught syntax at Washington University as a postdoc for a very short period of time. She was amazing. You can tell somebody is a spectacular teacher when you have their students in another class and they say, how come you're not as good as she is? Okay. So she was absolutely amazing. All of these folks really have done a tremendous job. But I'm here as the Edward Sapir Professor. Those of you who have honored me with this don't know my personal connection to Edward Sapir. But, I skipped something. There's a line on the bottom about the history of linguistics here in California. Those of you that are affiliated with linguistics at any UC campus, the rest of the nation has linguistics envy. You guys already knew that, but as someone who grew up in this state and watched the evolution of linguistic science here, it was really quite extraordinary, okay? Berkeley and UCLA came on like gangbusters, right? Then they spread to UC San Diego. Irvine established a campus. I remember when Wally and Marion and Sandy went to San Diego. I read your proposal. I don't know how I ended up in the loop. I'm like, we've got all these linguistics departments. Why would we need one in Santa Barbara? It was because we're going to do it different, we're going to do it better. And they've been, you guys have been rocking it ever since, right? UC Davis, a very similar story, fairly by comparison to the others, a young department, but one incredibly distinguished. You are here witnessing, the emergence of this. The only thing missing right now is we need a linguistics department at UC Merced. You got a new campus there. There's growth opportunity. If each one of these powerhouses sent one faculty member there on a rotational basis, it would be, the 8th strongest linguistics department in the country, right? So congratulations to the University of California, the entire system, and again to our host here for just spectacular contributions to linguistic science. We all owe a tremendous debt to Edward Sapir. No matter what you study in linguistics, you owe a debt to Edward Sapir. Not only was he brilliant, but the cognitive foundations of linguistic science, the social foundations of linguistic science, are embedded in his iconic early studies. My first introduction to his work was his 1925 paper in language that defined the phoneme, right? It was amazing and intimidating at the same time. What you don't know is that I took a course on Native American languages and was able, at the University of Pennsylvania actually, as the archive of all of Sapir's handwritten notes, and I studied Takelma, all right? And I did a class on, my project was to translate how a Takelma house is built. Now, those of you that have had the opportunity on working on Native American languages, I want to describe my experience, right? Because I actually felt that I was having a physical transformation in my brain as it was being rewired to understand and comprehend this language, right? And Sapir's notes were amazing. All of this done pre-technology, no tape recorders, phonetic transcription in the field. He was absolutely amazing, and to be here in his name it just takes my breath away. I'm going to talk to you about my legal work, and specifically about 6 cases. The first one is Roger Schei's case. It's the case that brought forensic linguistics to birth. And then the others are mine. And let's get into it. So, in 1978, Cullen Davis, Texas millionaire, was accused of murdering his wife Priscilla in their mansion, illustrated here. And the allegation was that Priscilla was having an affair, and Cullen found out about it and decided he was going to kill his wife and her lover. The FBI got an informant who allegedly was the hitman that Cullen Davis hired. They wired him and recorded a conversation where it sounds to the average person as if Cullen Davis actually admitted to the murder. Down on the bottom left, you see Cullen Davis in the middle of the two men, and on his left is his famous attorney, Racehorse Haynes. Those of a certain age will remember that he was one of the most preeminent criminal attorneys in the country, along with F. Lee Bailey and some of the others. And then you can see Cullen Davis getting carted away in the police car. So what happened was a bit of serendipity. Roger Schei was flying to a business trip in Dallas. And there was a person sitting, he was in first class. There's a guy sitting next to him. And the guy is writing, something out on a legal pad. And for whatever reason, Roger assumed he was a minister writing a sermon. And he asked him, he said, are you a minister writing a sermon? The guy chuckled and said, no, I'm an attorney. And the guy says, well, what do you do? And Roger said, oh, I'm a linguist. I study the way people speak. And the guy said, really? He said, how do you do that? He said, oh, I listen to tape recordings, evaluate whether there are dialect features or, their class backgrounds and things like that. And the guy said, can I have your business card? He said, I think there's somebody I'd like to introduce you to. They introduced Roger to Racehorse Haynes, and Racehorse Haynes hired Roger to be a linguistic expert in the trial. Now, for many years, I didn't fully understand Roger's work on this trial. I saw, people of my age actually saw the leaked video on the news where it looks like Cullen Davis hires a hitman, right? It looked like an open and shut case. You see a video, Cullen Davis is saying, so we're going to take them out, right? The other guy says, yep, how should we do this? I'm going to need an alibi. And they're having a conversation. In the video, you see that Cullen Davis starts the conversation in the car, gets out of the car, walks around to the trunk, opens the trunk, conversation is continuing, and then Cullen Davis comes around and gets back in the car. What no one knew, except for Roger, who's working with the defense team, is that there were two recordings. One recording was the audio recording of the guy sitting in the car who was wiretapped with a mic like I have. And the other was a long-distance video. What was leaked to the public was a matching of the two things to make it look like it was a single recording. Roger looked at this and he said, he said, there's something not quite right. And so what he did was he separated the two recordings and realized that Cullen Davis couldn't hear everything the guy was saying. The guy is speaking in a normal tone of voice, picked up on the mic, but not picked up by Cullen Davis. The police had enough on the guy to try to get the conviction on Cullen Davis. And so what happens is he manipulated what he was saying to imply guilt. Racehorse Haynes does this brilliantly. He asks Roger on the witness stand to come to his conclusion without presenting any evidence. Roger says, well, I think that, your client has really not been adequately represented here, and that he really was unaware of, what was being asked. Racehorse Haynes stops. Prosecutor gets up and says, Professor, you've given a conclusion without any analysis whatsoever. Roger says, well, I've done an extensive analysis. Would you like to see it? Racehorse Haynes brilliantly set up the prosecutor so that the prosecutor asked the question that opened up the evidence that was exculpatory for Cullen Davis. And he got an acquittal, right? And that, the forensic linguistics started there. And if you want to know anything about forensic linguistics, Roger Scheid has written extensively on the topic, and he is the preeminent leader in the field. In my case, I got into it completely by accident. Bob did mention that I was invited as a younger scholar to spend a year at the Center for Advanced Studies in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University. I grew up in LA. LA is my hometown. I lived there so long ago that Western Airlines used to be here. If you're old enough, you remember Western Airlines was the only way to fly, and they used to have $19 flights between LA and San Francisco, all right? Now, I had been away for 35 years. I forgot about inflation, and oh, by the way, Western Airlines went away, but it cost as much money to fly from San Francisco to LA as JetBlue to fly to New York City, right? So when I went out there, my parents had a huge house in Los Angeles. My wife and kids were going to stay in LA. I was going to commute on the weekends. That lasted 2 weeks before I missed them so much that I wanted them to come up to the Bay Area. So I called around to various places and asked to see apartments. And in every instance was told, absolutely, come see them. Right? I went to see about 15 places altogether. But in about 4 instances, when I showed up in person, the person said, you're here to see the apartment? And I said, yes. And they said, oh, I'm so sorry. There's a mistake, right? Now, they've never ever said it's because you're black. But the black people in here know that they don't say, oh, you know, if you had sounded black on the telephone, I'd have never given you an appointment, you know, right? So I talked to a couple of law professors. I talked to a couple of law professors, and they said, you know, you can sue. You've got a case. And I thought, you know, I'm on leave. Do I really want to spend my time in the courtroom? And then I realized there's a wonderful research opportunity here. And because I grew up in inner city Los Angeles, you know, my initial elementary school was primarily minorities. And I could style shit, you understand? I didn't always, in fact, at the school I went to, you didn't want to sound like, okay? My peer group did not especially want to sound like, you know, broadcasters on television, you understand? Because those people were not popular, all right? In fact, those were the bookish ones that were both talked about as the lames. Ain't nobody want to be no lame if you're from the inner city, right? So at any rate, you know, I had some scholarship. Plus, there were Chicanos at the school that I went to, right? And so there was a lot of language mixing and language play. And I realized that what you're seeing here in this public service announcement from the National Fair Housing Alliance was something that I could test in an experimental way. But when I got into this, I realized other people had thought about this before I had. So much so that when I was 10 years old, there was a movie that came out, West Side Story, and the very housing discrimination issue that I was dealing with had been described previously.
Lots of new housing with more space.
Lots of doors slamming in our face.
I'll get the terrace apartment.
Better get rid of your accent.
Okay? Now, it's not bad enough that they looked at this in 1960. Those of you that have spent any time in church will know that this was actually described in the Bible. Judges 12:6, the original definition of shibboleth was the first attestation of linguistic profiling with lethal consequences, right? And the circumstances were such that if you could not pronounce shibboleth and pronounced it sibboleth, they killed you, right? Everything else about you, your clothing, your appearance, you know, was sufficiently similar that the only way that they could tell the difference between the two groups was their pronunciation of this word, right? So obviously there were no telephones back then, okay? But clearly the issue of linguistic discrimination existed long before I began to work on the subject.
Hello, yes, can I ask a few questions about the apartment on Park Street?
What was your name?
My name is Juan Hernandez.
Stay right there.
Who is gone? Hello, my name is Sanjay Kumar. I'm calling about the apartment on Park Street.
It's not available.
Not available? Hello, my name is Tyrone Washington. I'm calling about the apartment on Park Street.
Stay right there.
Hello, I am Chen Yi. My name is Khalid bin Ali. I'm Tuan Vo. Hello, my name is Moshe Goldberg. I use a wheelchair. It's gone. Not available. All right. Thank you. Yes, hello, my name is Graham Wellington. I'm calling about the apartment for rent on Park Street. Is that still available?
Yes, it is.
It is?
Yes.
Really? Housing discrimination is illegal. If you think you've been a victim because of your race, color, national origin, sex, religion, disability, or family status, call us. Fair housing. It's not an option. It's the law.
Now, this particular public service announcement was based on a study that I did in the San Francisco Bay Area the year that I was at the Center for Advanced Studies in the Behavioral Sciences. Those of you that know this area will recognize the communities there, but for those of you that are not from this area, East Palo Alto and Oakland are the cities that have the largest minority populations. And also, they are less affluent than San Francisco. Also, this is San Francisco pre-Google, right? So Google has kind of changed the demographics of what it costs to live in San Francisco. Back then, there were, minority neighborhoods. Mary Buckles did a wonderful book called White Kids, based on research in this community. Palo Alto, quite affluent, and Woodside is extremely affluent. And so I always use the phrase, hello, I'm calling about the apartment you have advertised in the paper. And the only thing that I modified in my speech was the phonology. Why? Because if I modified anything grammatically, it's possible that that might have been the trigger that people would use to say, oh, gee, that's the feature that's, marks him as African American. So I wanted to know whether or not the difference between, hello, I'm calling about the apartment you have advertised in the paper, and hello, I'm calling about the apartment you have advertised in the paper, and hello, I'm calling about the apartment you have advertised in the paper, if those three renditions got different reactions, right? And they certainly did. The more affluent the community, the less likely the minority renditions were going to get an appointment. And the way that I did this was I had 3 different names, 3 different returning phone call numbers, and I would toss a coin to decide whether I was going to do Chicano English or African American English first. I would wait, no less than 45 minutes. Sometimes would call back the next day, but I would always use the mainstream standard American English rendition last. And the reason for that is because if I had included that initially and they had given me an appointment speaking standard English, if any of the minority renditions were turned down, it could have been because they already gave the appointment to somebody else. So I was looking for the pattern of rejection, acceptance, which is illustrated in the public service announcement that you saw. Also, that public service announcement was produced without my knowledge or consent or advice. And when I first saw it, I said, that's not realistic. If somebody is calling for an apartment, they're going to try to produce their best linguistic rendition. This guy who is, using the different dialects uses his best linguistic rendition at the end, right? I'm talking to advertisers. They all look at each other, they roll their eyes, and they say, professor, you professors think you got all the time in the world to tell anybody everything you want. We got 60 seconds to get your message across, right? And they said, we hope we did it effectively. In fact, they did do it quite effectively. That advertisement was produced in 2003. It won the Public Service Announcement Award for the year for the advertising agencies. And it was very helpful in one way, and it was problematic in another. The way that it was helpful was it began to alert people to the fact that when they were denied access to housing, that it might not be the case that the apartment wasn't available, right? But what also happened was apartment managers became aware of the research and they stopped engaging in overt door slamming, and they would show the apartment to people and then throw their application in the trash, right? Years later, the research was replicated by a sociologist, Doug Massey at Princeton, and he did something that should have dawned on me when I first did the study. He kept track of those rental agencies that used answering machines to screen the calls. Anytime I reached the answering machine, I treated it as a missed call. Doug was able to demonstrate that many of these unscrupulous landlords used their answering machines as a screening device. If they detected a minority dialect, they never called the person back. Try taking that to court, right? Because you never received a phone call back. So what's the basis of the discrimination, right? So this work, which started in 2001, has really been influential in actually changing how we look at discrimination in the housing market. Why? Because prior to this research, the Justice Department was equipped to look at face-to-face discrimination, but they had no means whatsoever to look at discrimination that might take place over the telephone. Now, when I get into the courtroom, the wild card is the judge. Judges have tremendous control in their courtrooms, and in some instances, what would happen is the judge would say, Professor Baugh, did you try to rent the apartment yourself? And if I said no, they say, thank you, sir, you're excused, right? Luckily for me, most judges are bored to death, and they seldom have a linguist in their courtroom. And so what would happen is they became curious about linguistics. And so the prosecutors would say, I object to what he's saying. And the judge would say, no, let him talk. So that was really very helpful. But what would typically happen is the landlord, who was the defendant in the case, would try to say it. I didn't know the person was African American. I didn't know the person was Italian, right? And if everything went well, I had a series of recordings that said, okay, if you can't tell that, let's see what you can tell. And I played an adult and a child's voice. Can you tell the difference between the child and the adult? I play a New Yorker and somebody from Mississippi. I play a man and a woman, right? Now, this is always effective when it's in front of a jury, because my recordings take you closer and closer to the test case, right? To the point where there's a Chicano voice and the voice of a Texan, right? Can you tell which one is Mexican American or not? At that point, the defendant tries to say, I can't tell. And the jury is like, those are the cases that were a lot of fun. But it changed people's lives. And it was really very, very amazing. Okay. Fast forward, and I do enough of this work that I start getting calls from other people. In this particular instance, it was a murder case where the defendant had been recorded in jail. What you see on this slide are inmates making their phone calls. If you're arrested and you make a call from jail, they record them, and they can be used against you, all right? And they do use them against you. In this particular case, what happened was the defendant was talking to his cousin on the telephone, and the cousin said to him, he said, homie, why don't you do a speedy trial? And he said, well, I'm going to do a speedy trial when I know I committed this shit, right? the prosecutor interpreted that as an admission of guilt. He didn't hear him say ain't, right? This was rapid speech in the dialect. It wasn't a full stop T on the word ain't. It was a nasalized diphthong, all right, before a stop consonant. And so we had to do some experiments to show the difference between the two. All right, so I know I committed this shit versus I know I ain't committed this shit. Again, the T is not pronounced with ain't. I am so sorry I didn't know Pam or had to take. I'm taking Pam's class now. I wish I had taken Pam's class then. Okay, because I presented this evidence in court. The top one is I know I committed this shit. The bottom one is I know I ain't committed this shit. For those of you that haven't looked at spectrographic analysis, you'll notice that the bottom one here, right? You'll see the transition before the stop consonant. There's weaker energy for the nasalized diphthong. Even though you can see the difference in the spectrograph, it's hard to hear in rapid speech, but it's significant. In this particular instance, whether or not you hear that phony is the difference between guilt or innocence, potentially the guilt between a conviction or an acquittal, the difference between life and death, right? So in this case, linguistic science was fundamental. He was up for the death penalty. Based on this evidence, even though he was convicted and received a guilty plea, he was given parole. I mean, he was given a life sentence with the possibility of parole. And the reason was, if additional exculpatory evidence came forward, you don't want to have killed him, right? So he didn't lose his life. He was convicted. But this particular evidence, and I thought I had a much better case, because what happened was there were lots of other errors in the transcript, right? And I remember I said that he said, Mama do a speedy trial, right? The prosecutor had written out, why would I do a speedy trial? Well, that's not what he said, right? And so I was able to show lots of errors, right? The jury, for the most part, were nodding their heads. But there were some people in the jury where I believed that English was not their mother tongue, right? And the prosecutor asked me, said, can you hear this? And I said, if you slow it down and you play it, you should be able to hear it. But I think what happened was that there were some people who really had difficulty hearing the two things. Even though there was a question of doubt, there was other evidence that implied his guilt. There's another case that I would like to look at, and this particular case was absolutely horrific. The facts about the case. There's a young man, lived in Baltimore. He was a gang member. He was involved with drug sales and, tried to live a lifestyle where drugs and flashing a lot of money was part of his demeanor. And he met a young African-American woman. He was in his early 20s. She too was in her early 20s. I think they first met when she was around 19. But she lived in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. So he would commute from Baltimore to see her in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And they dated off and on for about 3 years. The relationship was intimate. They had times where they were quite close and stayed together. And then they had periods where they were broken up, right? Eventually, she said, I need to call this off. This isn't going to work. You need to just not come anymore, right? And when she called it off, he would still show up maybe once every 2 months. He would drive, show up at her apartment, knock on the door, say, hey, I need to talk to you. And then he would, in the vernacular, maybe baby, please, take me back. And sometimes they would go out to dinner, sometimes they were intimate. right? The psychologists will, in the room will realize this kind of reinforcement isn't going to get you to go away, all right? But she meets another guy. She meets a guy who's got a good job, young brother, church-going brother, right? From a good family in her local community, and they start dating, and they fall in love, and it becomes serious. Now, she's working at the time as a waitress at a restaurant. He had some other kind of job. I think he was like working for UPS or something like that, delivering trucks. But at any rate, on the night in question, she gets off work around 10 o'clock. He picks her up. They go get pizzas, and they go back to her place. They're going to watch movies. No, I'm not going to say. Right. They're going to have pizza, watch movies, and be together, right? So they go back to the apartment, and by the time they get back to the apartment, it's 10:30, quarter to 11. He goes upstairs to take a shower. Okay? He's in the shower. There's a knock on the door. It's the old boyfriend from Baltimore, right? She opens the door, and he says, "Hey, I got to talk to you." Now, she let him into the apartment, right? And she says, I can't talk right now. I got company." And the old boyfriend says, "Well, I don't care. Tell him to leave." She said, "No, you got to leave," right? He got upset, pulls out a 9mm gun, shoots her in the neck. She hits the floor. He goes upstairs, pumps 8 bullets into the boyfriend that's in the shower, leaves him in a slump. Comes, steps over her body and leaves, right? He thinks they're both dead. 45 minutes later, she comes to, drags herself to the neighbors. She can't talk because she's been shot in the neck, but she writes down the name of her assailant. This is the kind of evidence prosecutors welcome, all right? Because she's not dead, it's attempted murder and murder, right? So, he's a poor man. Second point, he was appointed public defenders, right? Now, we're going to get into the other facts a little bit later, but when he was appointed to public defenders, if you're a poor defendant, you don't get to pick your public defenders, right? They're assigned to you by the court. As he was working with his public defenders, he concluded that they weren't very helpful. So, at one of his court appearances, he asked the judge if the judge would assign new public defenders. The judge says, "Nope, you got to take the public defenders you got." And he said, "But Your Honor, they're not helping." He said, "I need somebody that's going to help." The judge says, "I'm sorry, unless you can provide your own attorneys, you have to stick with public defenders that you've got," right? So he then makes the decision to defend himself, right? He's within his right to serve as his own attorney, and he chooses to serve as his own attorney. And in so doing, he's honest about his perception about the likelihood that he's going to receive a fair trial, but in so doing, he says things that were really not beneficial to his case or the likelihood that he would receive an acquittal. And essentially, when he had an opportunity to speak in the courtroom, he told everyone present, he said, my life has been rough. He said, my life has been quite hard. And he said, and most of the difficulty I've had in life has been in dealing with white people. And he said, now I'm on trial for my life, and I got a white judge, a white prosecutor, and an all-white jury. What are my chances, right? Well, if I had been advising him, I would have said, hey, he's up on it, bro. These are the people who are going to say whether you're guilty or not, right? He was being honest, right? He was being honest and sincere, but they convicted him, right? So they convicted him, and he was waiting to be sentenced And he went through an appeal process, and while he was going through an appeal process, it was a little over a year, but another unexpected thing happened. And the unexpected thing that happened was that the judge and the prosecutor had both been found to be exchanging racist and homophobic emails on their government computers using pseudonyms. When he caught wind of that, he said, they're racially biased. I didn't get a fair trial. The news has shown that these men are racist and that they're sharing these racist and homophobic materials, and I did not receive a fair trial. I want a new trial with a different judge, right? And so what happened was they then brought in an external judge to evaluate the case, to see whether or not he did in fact receive a fair trial. That judge, the evaluating judge, concluded that it was an imperfect trial, but that it was still a fair trial. And what made the trial imperfect was the fact that during the closing remarks, the prosecutor referred to the defendant as a big city guy who had come to Carlisle, a big city guy who had come to the small town, he had been disrespected, and he was seeking revenge, right? And what he said, what the defendant said, was there were racial overtones to that assessment of characterizing him as a big city guy. The judge concluded, no, that was not racial in nature. You would have had to say something explicit about race, right? In other words, he's a big city black guy, or he's a big city black man, right? That was the judge's assertion about whether or not there would have been any hint of racial bias. Well, here's a picture of the defendant, okay? When I got involved in this case and was analyzing the data as to whether or not there was any bias, I realized that he's sitting in the courtroom when the prosecutor is making his comments, right? So referring to the defendant as a big city guy who had been disrespected, there's no need to redundantly make reference to the fact that he's black. You can see he's black. He's sitting in the courtroom, right? And so my question was, is there the possibility of any racial bias? Okay? So here are 4 possibilities. The judge said this was a fair trial. No, the judge said number 2, right? All of us would like number 1, best scenario. You want a fair trial that's also ideally perfect, right? No, there's no such thing as a perfect trial, but you certainly want a fair trial. Is an imperfect trial fair? That's questionable. That's the judge's assertion. A contradiction would be an unfair trial that's also perfect, right? And our worst case scenario is an unfair trial that's also imperfect. Well, again, the judge would want us to believe that if you are not making overt reference to a person's race, that you shouldn't draw any racial inference, right? Now, what I'm going to share next is the content of one of the racial email, or one of the emails. I want you to conclude whether or not it has any racial relevance, all right? So this is section shower. You can read it for yourself. I'll wait for the gasps. Okay. So, should we draw any racial inference from this? According to what the judge said, you should not. There's no explicit statement about the racial composition of people being referred to, right? I would argue that anybody that knows anything about Detroit's inner city population would conclude that yes, this is racial innuendo, okay? So, based on this, I decided when I got involved in the case, the assertion that the statement that you're calling somebody a big city guy and that has no racial inference, that's a testable hypothesis. And so what I did was I conducted a survey. And in the survey, you can see in number 1, I'm asking people to describe a welfare queen. In number 2, I'm asking them to describe a meth head. You know, number 3 is the test case, and number 4 is a redneck. None of these make explicit references to race. But what you'll notice for number 3 on both of these, without the benefit of actually seeing the defendant, they believed that this was referring to an African American man, right? And when we actually look at the results of the survey, the vast majority of the people that completed the survey, without the benefit of any visual cues, concluded that the race of the person, the big city guy, was an African American. Now notice that white also gets a fairly substantial number. And in terms of the wealth of the person, there isn't a belief that the person is poor, right? And in terms of, so the breakdown of this, everybody thought that it was somebody involved in gang activity. The racial division was whether or not they thought it was an inner city gang member or a mafioso, right? To the extent that they thought the person was white, they thought it was kind of like a Tony Soprano character, okay? And therefore, they also assumed he was wealthy, right? So, and you can see how Tony Soprano would be a big city guy. But the vast majority of people thought that the person was African American, again, without any legal benefit. So we were able to use this evidence to show that the likelihood that there was bias was quite significant, and in fact, he deserved another trial. Now, I'd like to move into a completely different direction and look at a civil case. In this case, we're looking at a situation where several men in a class action suit, all of whom were born in Africa, moved to the United States as adults, became naturalized citizens, but they all spoke with strong accents. They had a colleague who worked with them as an airplane fueler, and he got promoted primarily because English was his native language, and he was considered to be able to be a more fluent communicator. The sentence at the bottom was what supposedly said to the employees, that the job of fueling an airplane was so easy that a monkey could do it. But there were a lot of other allegations that he actually routinely referred to the African-born employees as monkeys. And the question was, are there any racial overtones to that? Was there a hostile work environment as a result of referring to these men as monkeys? So I got very active in that case, and there's no shortage of depictions of black people as monkeys historically. I did add Disney's crows from Dumbo. If you saw Dumbo and you remember the crows, they clearly are intended to depict African Americans, and they do so in a demeaning way, right? But it gets more complicated than this. Why? Because most Americans are familiar with the phrase, you can throw a monkey wrench into it, or stop that monkey business, and that doesn't necessarily have any racial overtones. Our former president, Ronald Reagan, starred with a chimp in Bedtime for Bonzo. If you haven't seen it, you don't need to. The Marx Brothers have a film, Monkey Business, and of course, Johnny Weissmuller and Tarzan the Ape Man, right? Now, we got a white man that's helping us survive as black people in Africa. Right? So, but the point is that the issue of who refers to monkeys isn't always overtly racial. But there are instances where it is, and it's very offensive. The Obamas were routinely portrayed as monkeys during their presidency, and not only was this racist and offensive, but it wasn't limited to them. Bush and Trump and others who are white are also referred to as monkeys, right? So this was an interesting case from my standpoint. The smoking gun occurred when the supervisor encountered one of the men at lunch, and his wife had made an indigenous soup from their homeland. And the boss asked the man, he said, "What is that shit you're eating? Is that monkey soup?" Correct? That's when I had it. Now, I pointed out the monkey soup is ambiguous. It's either soup that contains chunks of monkey, or it's soup that's eaten by a monkey. Either way, monkey soup is not good, and it's not innocuous. It's not saying that the job is so easy that even a monkey can do it. It was a class action suit. It was in Phoenix, Arizona. We had to go to trial 3 times before we actually won that case. It got a little complicated because a couple of the class action defendants tried to say that there were racial overtones when the boss said that you guys, a robot could do this job, right? And one of the guys said, you know, in Ghana, somebody calling you a robot was racist, right? So I had to get on the witness stand and say, like, that's not as racist as calling somebody a monkey, right? But it took a while, but they did eventually win that case, all right? Where I'd like to close tonight is a trial that was another civil case, and it happened after 9/11. Now, I know there's a lot of young people in here where this is a story and not a vivid memory. Those who are older will know that when this happened, you remember where you were and what you were doing when you found out about this. But the Twin Towers was a horrific tragedy, and in 2001, everybody was a little bit jumpy, right? Now, before I get into more details of this, and I don't want everybody to jump out all at once and explain what these are, but we're going to talk about euphemisms, right? We're linguists. We can talk about euphemisms. So, here are 3 depictions, and somebody, as a show of hands, take one at a time and tell me what they represent. Anybody volunteer? Yes. Which one are you picking? It's raining cats and dogs, right? I can remember trying to explain to a student from Pakistan what that meant. Okay. Raining cats and dogs. Yes?
The second one is kick the can.
Kick the can, kick the bucket. All right. Which is a euphemism for what? Somebody dies. And does anybody want to take the last one? Yes. Turn over a new leaf, which means what? All right, very good, right? Okay, none of these things are literal, right? None of these things are literal. Well, what happened in this particular case was an African-American woman who had previously been on welfare. She's a single mom, managed to get herself off of welfare and started to work for the city of Oakland. She had a good job working for the city of Oakland, and she got ensnared with a traffic violation. And during the traffic violation, you know, she got a ticket, and she ended up having to go to court. So, I mean, she had to pay a fine. So she goes in to pay the fine, and when she's in line to pay the fine, she's on her lunch hour. And it's a long line, and she's standing in the line, and she realizes she needs to go to the bathroom. Number 2, not number 1. So she's got to decide, do I get out of line or do I stay in line? She decides to stay in line. An elderly white woman gets in line behind her. As she's kind of hopping from foot to foot, she innocently says to the woman behind her, as soon as I'm finished up at that window, I'm going to go drop the bomb in the bathroom. She goes to the bathroom. A police break in, guns drawn, they arrest her for threatening a building and so on and so forth. She gets a public defender. Public defender tells her, admit guilt. Just admit you're guilty. You get probation, you'll be fine. Right? Yeah, what? Whoever said what? Yeah, right. Okay. She was like, I didn't do it. Right? And he said, yes, but if you go to trial and you lose a trial, you'll do jail time, you'll lose your kids. If you just admit guilt, You won't lose your kid and you'll just be on probation. So she was like, I really don't want to do that because, probation means I lose my job. If I admit guilt to this, I'm not going to have my job in the city. I'll be back on welfare, right? Now, her attorney should have been the one that found me. She found me. I answered the phone one day. She says, "Are you Professor Baugh, a linguist?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Can you help me?" I said, "I don't know." What's going on? And she tells me the story. And I said, "Okay." I said, "Give me your attorney's name and his fax number. I'll fax him my curriculum vitae." I fax it to the guy. He says, "Wow, he's good. we can use him. How did you find him?" Right? And she's like, "Well, I found him." Right? So, at any rate, I asked her. I didn't even really talk to her attorney. I said, "Give me the judge's name." I wrote the judge a letter explaining what euphemisms were. That she had chosen her words poorly, but that it was never her intention to bomb the building. Right? He dropped the case. She gets off. Her record is clean. She calls me a couple of days later, and she said, "Professor Baugh," she said, "I can't thank you enough because you saved, my career, my job, my family's life." She said, "What do I owe you?" Right? And I thought about it for a second, and I said, "No." And she was like, "Black." So I said, "No, sister." I said, "Somewhere down the line," I said, "if you won't be able to tell when, an opportunity is going to come up where you can help somebody else." I said, "If you do that at some point in the future," I said, "that's all the money I need." Right? And I can't tell you how good that made me feel. Right? It was worth more than any amount of money I could ever receive. And as linguists who may share my concern about justice, we're in a unique position to alert people not only to linguistic discrimination, but to prove what's an edict in our field. All languages and dialects are equal, and their speakers are worthy of our attention and respect. Thank you for your time. I'm cashing in on my long-standing friendship with John Rickford. We were in graduate school together. He's coming to speak to my class on July 15th. We're going to see if we can find a larger room. He's probably going to talk about his new legal cases. So I believe the staff is going to put something up on the events for what the venue might be. But if you're free on July 15th at 11:10, please come join us and see what John has to say. And thank you again very much. I appreciate it. And we can take a couple questions, but I still drink and I'm ready for one. Yes. I have not tried to advertise this work at all. It finds me somehow, and I've had more of it than I care to have in some ways. So I've been really kind of trying to keep it to a minimum because I love my actual scholarship, the writing of books and doing research that I'm in control of. When I serve as a consultant, I lose control. And so I'm happy to do this. And I'm now in a position where I can pick and choose the cases that I work on. So when a case comes to me, I'm very careful. Also, there's a TV show called Wrong Man. It's on Stars. I'll appear on that on a murder case. This one is very interesting. It's a black man whose ex-girlfriend was wiretapped, and they tried to get a conviction on him, and he was railroaded, right? And it should be on sometime next year, but look the wrong man. You'll see me on TV. But yeah, the cases have managed to find it, but thank you for that. All right, anybody else? Yes.
There are definitely black judges, there are black public defenders and so forth. I would expect that there are no cases like this, but if you invert everything, is it imaginable that then there's an Anglo defendant who complains about something from the black public defender and the black majority jury?
You know, it's interesting.
You know anything like that?
So, I wasn't going to talk about this particular thing, but so since you brought it up, one of the cases that I didn't take was one of a black judge who had been accused of racial bias against black defendants in his courtroom by a 3-judge panel of his peers who were white. And basically, this particular judge used vernacular dialect and profanity when interacting with black defendants in his courtroom, and tried to justify it by saying that, hey, we're from the same cultural background. So when I call somebody a motherfucker in my courtroom, it's because we're from the same cultural background. This doesn't have any racial implications. I'm trying to motivate these young black people because I know where they come from, right? So at any rate, he wanted a black linguist to defend him. I said, no. Right? Because, and the one that really got to me was there was an African American woman in his court, and she said, Judge, please, you're the judge. Don't talk to me like that. And he said, well, if I didn't have these robes on, I'm here. And as soon as I read that, I was like, get his ass out of there. He's a black judge, but he has abused his position, right? And his sense of cultural empathy is just tremendously misplaced, right? So after I turned him down, Rickford turned him down, right? And eventually we tried to get him Tom Kochman, and Tom Kochman told him he was retired. So I don't know what that judge did, but when you get things flipped and a little bit too crazy, it just gets a little crazy. All right, let's go. Thank you.